Thanks very much, Ailsa. Now, I'm very conscious that we have probably strayed a wee bit into the hour that we have for this session, but I don't think we'll be entirely tight at the other end if we have sparkling conversation and still lots of questions and comments around. So what I'd like to do is, first of all, just in terms of, oh, have I lost you?
We're still here.
You're still here. I've lost you though. There you go.
Hi again, everyone. Agnes has just messaged to say they've lost their internet. So I think that the plan was for Frank and Fatima and Mairi to start off with giving a short sort of 3-4 minutes or so detail on their particular areas of work and how their work intersects with community heritage and community ownership. So I think Mairi and Fatima, if you're happy to do that, shall we kick off and do that? And then hopefully we'll get Agnes and Frank back again. So I'll come to you first, Mairi, if that's okay. And everyone's super keen. We've still got loads of people on the call keen to hear about the work that you're involved with, and in particular this whole ownership, heritage, and an area of work that we've been really involved with, the whole sort of concept of Gufkus. So over to you, Mairi. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks, Ailsa. Hi, Fatima. Hi, everyone. Really interesting to hear all the behind the scenes work of Community Land Scotland. Yeah, my name's Mairi. I live and work in the Highlands, although I didn't grow up here. I'm actually from the borders via Edinburgh, really, but now very happy in Abriachan, just above Loch Ness, where I've been for the past few years. I work freelance as a researcher, as an educator, as a creative collaborator. So really I work with lots of different people all over the place, which is great. But I do have a background in academic teaching and research in Scottish and creative ethnology. You're probably thinking, what is that? But I suppose it's described as the kind of meeting point between history, anthropology, and art. You know, this idea, how do we make sense of the past from within our present, and how can this understanding help us to shape our future, I suppose. But today, really, I find myself working more in the area of human ecology, which is very much connected to ethnology. It's the study, as I'm sure you know, of human community, the relationship between people and the natural environment. And right now, I'm actually a human ecology researcher in residence, which is very exciting, for a Riverwoods ecological restoration project. And I also contribute to learning programs for the Centre for Human Ecology Learning Co-op now, which includes as part of that programme, of course, the story of community land back to its radical roots. And I suppose in my work, I often draw on this lovely idea of the carrying stream, to use a lovely phrase from folklorist Hamish Henderson, to describe the living flow and carrying of tradition and culture from the past into the future. So, you know, this contains music, song, poetry, folklore, as well as histories and stories of resistance and struggle, you know, a carrying stream very much open to new ideas and voices and possibilities. And I suppose I've also spent probably more than a lot of time thinking about this idea of heritage and what it means, intangible, tangible, otherwise, and in other contexts such as Gaelic, and what we can learn from different worldviews. Although I would admit, I really, and maybe I shouldn't admit this, but I really don't like the word heritage. I think it's a terrible word, but maybe we could chat about that. I think lots of people think of heritage as something that's, you know, fixed in the past, but I kind of think of it much more as a kind of process of making meaning, or meaning making, a kind of selective interpretation of the past to create a narrative in the present. So in that sense, it can really speak as much to present concerns as much as to the past. And in our time of climate and ecological crisis, I mean, this just for me frames all of the work that I'm doing. In our time, I'm interested very much in how place-based cultural heritage can be a source to help us imagine and build more hopeful futures. And I think one of the main aims of cultural ecological thinking, of decolonial thinking too, is to bring forward the kind of many and diverse forms of knowledge and culture that have been overshadowed or silenced by these dominant narratives of empire, of globalization, of progress, and advocating for local cultures as a way to resist the monoculture, if you like, of rampant destructive capitalism. And I think there's also solidarity in that. And at this juncture in history, I suppose we're just profoundly challenged to recover ways of living in balance, to restore life and community. And through cultural heritage, we have an incredible resource to bring us together, really, to reconnect. And the practice of finding, reclaiming cultural heritage that's connected to the land, that's connected to the environment, and reviving or inventing new traditions for our own time, for the future, is perhaps one way to begin to mend this relationship with the world around us. So lots of things going on, and really looking forward to this conversation. So maybe over to you, Fatima, if that okay as an intro? I don't know.
That was a good intro, Mairi. My apologies.
No, it's okay.
Over to you, Fatima.
That was fantastic. Lovely listening to that. Thank you so much. And really following on from that, for those of you who don't know Govanhill Baths Community Trust, we're infamous and we're very proud of that. We are the longest occupation of a building in British history, with a 24-hour picket line for 145 days. An incredibly inspiring history to our campaign, which we're very, very proud of, and encourage other people. And one thing I will start with by saying is, if you haven't occupied a bit of land or a public building, do so. It's one of the most empowering, exhilarating things for any community. And in a, you know, we spend our lives having to follow rules and regulations that don't often benefit us, or don't always benefit us, and seizing something that you absolutely love and convinced that you can make better for the wider community is a wonderful feeling, and it shouldn't be underestimated. I think for us, I'll just give you a quick snapshot of our community, because I think that's very, very important, very, very different to the previous speaker. We have about 18,000 people in our community. It's one of the most densely populated, well, it is one of the most densely populated in Scotland, but it is also a very, very small community geographically. It's about 2 square miles. So you can imagine the number of people living in horrendous housing, a lot of slum housing, a lot of private housing, very little social housing in the area. And our building was built 100 years ago, Govanhill Baths, one of the only buildings of its kind left in Glasgow. Nearly all of the others have been demolished, or there are a couple of private swimming pools, much smaller versions. And the building itself, in terms of our cultural heritage, was incredibly important. People wanted a beautiful building in a working class community that they had come to expect was part of their everyday life for over 100 years. And when that was taken away from them, you can imagine how angry people were. The building is not only beautiful, but it has served the well-being needs of generations of people. So your great-grandmother would have used the steamy, you would have used the swimming pool, your kids would have learned to swim there, you would have done some well-being classes in there. So it has a history to it, a social history to it that can't be underestimated. From day one, we were quite conscious that we had to capture this in some way, and our arts and heritage program has been with us really from then, 22 years ago. We've been doing this for 22 years. I started off as one of the occupiers, and now I'm the CEO. And we've gone from a campaigning organisation to what is now, I don't know what we'd call ourselves, but we've embarked on a £12 million project to restore it and run the facility for the needs and aspirations of our community. So that is our history, and that is a living history. And we have an archive and heritage program that we've had for a number of years, which celebrates, collects a history of the building, but also the social history that went to making that building alive, and then for the future that will continue. And I think that living history is very, very important. So we do everything from, publications such as this. We have our own publishing house where we publish histories of the social area. So whether it was the Little Donegal, as the place was called for a very, very long time. And of course, the Irish people that lived in Govanhill also built Govanhill Baths and built the tenements around it. And we think our building can't just be seen as a history within itself, but actually the role it played within the wider community. We are the most diverse community outside of London in the UK, which has an incredibly exciting abundance of new cultural identities that are influencing both the new design of the building, but also its future usage. So I love Govanhill, and I think everyone who is involved in a campaign to save something loves their community. That's why they do it. And this building is very, very important to us, not just the history of where it's come from, but we think the future and the legacy that we're going to be continuing for future generations. So I like the word heritage. It's got a bit of gravitas to it. I think the problem is working class people have never been told that they do have a heritage, or poor people have been told that they should celebrate that heritage. And I think that's one of the things we've been really determined to do from the outset. So thank you for inviting me.
Thanks very much, Fatima. Now, I see a wee spark starting to develop here, and usually the next speaker doesn't avoid a spark. So over to you, Frank, in the other room.
Good morning, everyone. I hope the connection maintains. I don't know where to start after that. That was quite a tour de force by the previous two. My background, I guess, in this is quite diverse, really, very diverse. I'm by inclination and by training a natural scientist, so I look at the land quite differently from many people. In geology, I began with as an undergraduate and a PhD. So my connection with the land begins with the physical stuff of the land, the actual rocks, the things you walk across, build your house on, drive your car over. And of course, that leads on to the shape of the land, the morphology, the geomorphology, the valleys and the rivers and the easiest places to put a road, for example, or a settlement. That creates its own soil and its own vegetation, its habitat, attracts the wildlife. So that's got me very much into the biodiversity of a place, and the fellow travellers on the land is intimately connected for me with the place names of the area. A thing that's rapidly receding as people become much more a sort of global culture and not going to places that people used to go to, for example, on the moor or on the shore, on the Shielings. And that, of course, is tied up with the history of the place, the culture of the place, and the stories of the communities and the inhabitants of that area, not just in present, but back into the extended time. I mean, it's about, 40 years ago since C.E. McKeever there and John Watt, we were involved in the Scottish Crofters Union, which was essentially a community association. It wasn't a trade union, but it brought together all these elements of agriculture, of belonging, of housing, of settlement, of population, of economic activity in communities that was intimately tied with the land. And I've tried to reflect that in several books. There's another book hopefully coming out in the spring as well. And I think to me the connection, that connectivity with the land is fundamental. You can't get away from it. You can choose to ignore it, and particularly if you live in a city and it seems to be irrelevant, because you can just walk along the road there and you don't see fields and forests and landscapes, so you haven't got that visceral connection perhaps as obvious when you see concrete all around you, but it's there nonetheless, and it's very, very embedded in the sense of a place and belonging to an area. And even if you've moved into the area from elsewhere, I think it's fundamental to understand that connection with place, even if you don't necessarily feel it as acutely as someone who's lived there for 5 or 6 or 7 generations. So loads of things to talk about. Happy to explore out of that further and just let's wing it as it goes.
Mairi, can I come to you with my own kind of first thoughts, following on from the three of you, your very different, very brief presentations, and I totally understand that for all three of you, given your work, that these were very much summaries of much longer presentations that we could look to have another time, which would be fascinating. But I wonder if you, I mean, you all come from very different communities, it would seem. But to me, the thread is community. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, we're talking about people and where people are and what people do. So, and okay, bearing in mind that the word heritage doesn't do it for you, there must be other words that do. But what is it for you? What for you is the heritage thread that reaches across your community? And how do you use that in a way that brings people together, holds people together, and also invites new people in with you?
You're very good at crafting these questions, Agnes. Thanks very much. Well, yeah, as I said, I suppose I work across lots of different communities and groups exploring these ideas. So it's not easy to speak of my community as such, although I do live in one place, in Abriachan, of course, a place that has its own fascinating story, its own community-owned woodland, celebrating 25 years this year, which is amazing. But, you know, I've not been there that long. I've not really been involved in the story of this place, although I've been learning and really hope to be part of its story going into the future, if you like. I'm very excited for Community Land Week next week. But I really like that you use this metaphor of the thread, if you like, the heritage thread, because my kind of long-term collaborator, Urras Sandylands, once described the kind of creative work that we do together as cultural darning and mending, which was a phrase that I really loved, you know, seeking out these and finding disparate and disconnected threads from the past and kind of weaving them back together with purpose, kind of repair and restoration work, if you like, tracing, as Frank said, through place names, you know, the lifelines and songlines of a landscape. For example, you know, as Frank said, looking at place names, we can learn that land that is perhaps now completely different to Fatima's context, you know, devoid of people and community, was once known and named and stewarded and cared for, is very powerful. And this helps us imagine what these landscapes could and should look like flourishing into the future. And of course, you know, my personal interest really in song and poetry, there exists a cultural memory of a different time of what these places used to look like when our ecologies were far richer, and also a cultural memory, of course, of community, of solidarity, of conviviality, of shared work across the cycle of the year. So Ranich and I have written about this together, a wee essay which was published in various places, including Atlas Arts on Skye, who do amazing work. And in that essay, we make reference to land activist Alistair McIntosh, familiar to you all, I'm sure. And he writes about these different stages of the land reform process, the first of which is awareness raising. And he says that kind of nested in this first step, there are 3 steps within that of remembering, revisioning and reclaiming. And I suppose we see that kind of act of cultural darning and mending as part of this first stage of putting back together that McIntosh speaks of, which I think the idea is, you know, simple. It can really build that cultural confidence at a community level and hopefully create the circumstances necessary to be able to then revision more hopeful futures, and maybe even then take land into collective stewardship or ownership, which we've seen has been so powerful. So yeah, and maybe I'll come back to this if I've rambled on a bit too long, but you asked me about words which might be alternative. And, you know, in Gaelic, we have this lovely concept of duchas, and been trying my best to kind of spread ideas about this around in different contexts, but being careful not to kind of do a hooget on it, you know, from Scandinavia and kind of taking away from its power. But, you know, from a Gaelic perspective, there is a worldview in which embodies a very different way of relating to the land. And, you know, to quote, I think, scholar Michael Newton, it's a worldview in which people belong to places rather than places belonging to people, which I think is really powerful. And duchas is a way of expressing a sense of belonging to the land, but also a stewardship, a sense of care for that land into the future, and also recognizing that fundamental relationship between land, people, culture. And I think it's really generative and could speak more about how we can inspire future generations to think about that. So anyway, I love talking
Indeed.
about this. So yeah.
I think we all do. I think
Yeah.
we all do. I'll just drop in a wee bit of kind of local information there is, and that we ourselves in the Ghabhsainn Estate Trust area, we've for many years now run a festival each year, which is very, very much rooted in the community, which we titled Urras, for all the reasons that you gave. And clearly we are very much still a very strong Gaelic speaking community. On that note, Fatima, you mentioned in your introduction earlier on that the area is huge, this area of huge number of people compared to where I live, where Mairi lives, where Frank lives, once was very much, had strong links with Donegal, but now much, much wider, you know, people from all over the world, I guess it's fair to say.
Yes.
So how do you manage that, I guess, is the question. And how do you find a way that everybody feels that they have part of it and they belong?
That's a lovely question, actually. I do, just before I answer that, I just want to say, you mentioned that one word that unites everybody in terms of people who are involved in Community Land Scotland, but for fighting for their ownership of land and resources. I think it's more than community. I think it's community activism, and we sometimes do ourselves a disservice by just calling ourselves a community. There's something very passive about that, whereas we're all activists in trying to improve our lives and our community. And that's, for us, that is a theme that runs through all our work, and that can also be seen by the way we relate to our wider community. So Govanhill has got a nickname. It used to be, it is known as the Ellis Island of Scotland. It has a huge amount of immigration from the Highlands, you know, going down from the refugees in their own homeland, which is what happened in the clearances, came through Govanhill onto the boats. Some went to Finiston and so on. Little Donegal, biggest Irish community outside of Ireland at one stage. It was called Little Donegal, and you can still get a bus from Govanhill to Donegal every week if you're that way inclined. That heritage is still there. But of course, now we've got the largest Roma community in the whole of the UK. So that says something about the community itself. There is a safety there. There is a welcoming presence that has a history to it. That's often unspoken of. It's not like someone has sat down and said, come to Govanhill, immigrants welcome. It's just a feeling that's there. And I think what drives our heritage program is that we believe every single person has a right to a history, and that history should be discovered, it should be celebrated, and that contribution people have made, and everyone makes a contribution to where they live, should be discovered and celebrated. That's why we have books celebrating women's role in the suffragettes movement. So many domestic servants use Govanhill Baths to do the washing for their rich, you know, for their owners, but also women liberated from the home doing washing in a clean environment called the steamy. There are no pictures of steamies. There's none. There is none. No one thought to capture that history. We think that's important. Those women have a right to that history and their stories and that social history that came with that. And it's the same with the Roma people, and which is why we've been campaigning for an international Roma centre to celebrate that contribution Roma people are playing. So it's there, it's everywhere. We just have to be aware of it and make sure that people have a voice. They feel like their voice is just as important as anyone else's. So you have to consciously do that. How you do that on the land, I don't know. But I know every time I've just come from West Urras for a weekend away. My God, how beautiful was that? Except a whole month's worth of rain in 2 days. Well, you know, it's still beautiful. But so I think Mairi said before, there's a feeling, isn't there? There's something, people have tread this land before you have, and that lovely history should be captured and celebrated and made available to people. So you just have to consciously do it. And don't think you're not making history. Don't think what you're not doing should be collected. We work with other community groups to capture their history. So our archive goes and teaches people, you know, that poster you made 25 years ago about come to a community meeting to save our land. Someone kept that. Isn't that fantastic? That is your history. So you just have to be really conscious of it, I think, but do it and do it well. You know, collect your posters, collect your stories, collect photos of people in campaigns and the communities and so on, because that's our legacy. That's our heritage when we go. So we have a big heritage and archive elements. And I'll just finish off by saying, when we do finish building this building, renovating it 22 years later, we will have a museum to the steamy. We'll have a museum to the history of those women that use, hundreds of thousands of women use that place to do their washing. And we'll also have a museum, and we don't have one in Scotland, to amateur swimming, one of the most important physical activities, predominantly for working class people, that has no museum. So those are the two things we think we're going to leave in our legacy, apart from a beautiful building for other people to enjoy beyond us. Sorry about that. You can talk for ages, I'm sure.
Thanks, Fatima. Frank?
Well, I would take these ideas from Fatima and Mairi, and I would double them up, because my word would be the Gaelic word buntiness. Buntiness means a sense of belongingness. It's not just where you come from. It's about your connections, your kin, your neighbours, your community, your roots in the land. And you can flee away to Australia or New Zealand or live in America, but you can't escape your buntiness. You can't escape your DNA. It's within you. It's that thing. I did a book a couple of years ago, which was essentially the history of the world through the eyes of Ghabhsainn. Ghabhsainn is where we live, Ghabhsainn estate. And the book has been pretty well received, but basically it's a history of the world from the start of the planet right through to the present day, and the formation of Urras, Ghabhsainn, the Ghabhsainn Trust, Ghabhsainn Estate Trust. And then just about a year or so ago, there was commissioned to do a film of this, to make the links between Orkney, Shetland and the Hebrides, and thinking about what makes a place special, what defines a place. You have a special place, whether it's raining or not. And that makes you think about that place. And in the course of doing that, I went to the place where my grandparents' siblings came from. I discovered the grave of my great-grandparents and my great-great-grandparents, going back to about 1720 in Orkney. And the connection, the visceral connection with that place. They left because they couldn't continue farming, and they had to go and do other things. They had to move. And so there's a connection with all of these things, how it ties these things together. This is why I was picking up on something that Mairi didn't say but did imply. I hate the word rewilding. It really sets my lights on fire. This idea that these areas are wild or once were wild. All the evidence, all the research shows that when those glens were inhabited, when people lived there, and when they crofted and they grew grass and they had cattle and so on, there was a richer biodiversity than there is now. And so this idea of creating a fence around that and leaving it for people to wander across because of some mythical concept of wild places that you can escape to, it really is quite offensive. And I think we have to just bin that. I like the term ecological restoration. I'm all for that, about trying to improve the health of the natural environment and the surroundings that we have. But this idea about rewilding, it just is a nonsense, and it skews the argument completely from that. And I think we have to re-inhabit that and take charge of that argument, because it's about making healthy, vibrant communities within these places, and that, in a sense, means that we have to coexist with the natural environment rather than try to dominate it and cover it over as a car park. So yeah, we could go on to that forever and ever, and these things that goes through there. But again, that is the continuum for me that goes from the hard natural science right through to stories and poetry and descriptions of the place and physical renditions, paintings, and so on that convey the image of these places. I've got a book coming out, hopefully in the spring there, that's looking at fiction and non-fiction about how we think about land, because sometimes by going into fiction, it allows us to say things that we can't say in non-fiction, or can't say so clearly, because it allows us to speculate and to dream about these things. So exploring these ideas about how people think about land and what it means to them is really quite important. And this is why when people move into an area, presumably they're attracted by some of these things. And so you want to actually accentuate these things rather than try to, and to protect them, I guess, rather than to actually just cover them up and make sure that everywhere is exactly the same everywhere you go. The reason we go to Scandinavia is to see Scandinavian things and to eat Scandinavian food, etc., rather than just do exactly the same as you do in your own house. So I think there's a huge area of discussion within that as it goes through.
Fatima, can I come to you first for my next question, and that is well, my next point of discussion, I should say, rather than a question. My own sense is that the beauty of cultural heritage is that we wear it very lightly most of the time. We wear it so lightly that indeed sometimes we forget we have it.
Yes.
And I think all three of you have kind of referred to that in different ways. But yet there's something about it that speaks right across generations. So I just wonder, in terms of your own work there at Govanhill, and given the multicultural nature of the community that you work in, how do you, do you have any examples of projects that you've done that help you speak across these generations?
Yes. I've never been asked a question like that before. So I had to have a think about it. You always ask people to describe themselves and they go, oh, I don't know what to say, because we're more than one identity. We have so many facets to ourselves, but we're not used to talk, or some people are used to talking about themselves or identifying themselves. And it's when you sit down and you start asking people to tell their stories and they go, oh, you don't want to hear that. What do you want to hear that for? I've got nothing to say. And all of a sudden, when you start talking about a building or an event or what they were doing at a particular moment, that just opens up this whole new world. And what always upsets me is people don't think their voices are important. You don't want to hear that, Fatima. What do you want to hear that for? We just went there to wash clothes. And as soon as they start talking about that, you hear that they had to bring their children along and the kids were asleep underneath the drying horses. And it was a place where women learned about sexual health. Where did you go? Because you're stuck in the home. And they had all these stories which showed a microcosm, not just to their own lives, but to the wider lives of women. And I think for us, that's really important, that someone's story or their identity is not just about them. It usually has so much connection to what other people have also experienced in their lives. So for us, it's not just a building. People say, oh, I know, you guys, isn't it sad? You wanted to swim and they took that away from you. It was more than a swimming pool. It was more than a bit of land. It was more than a shed. It was about all the identities and lives and experiences that happened there. And we try and capture that in a diverse way as possible to make it accessible, because podcasts are great if you know how to speak English. The written word is great if you're not illiterate. You have to be creative. So we do lots of arts commissions. One thing we do a lot of, which is really, really, really popular, is we have a festival called the Govanhill International Festival, because one thing we are is aspirational, but celebrating the internationalism of our stories. It's not just something that happens locally. Is walking tours. Come and see this building. We're going to open it up and you can tell your story. We have Jewish walking tours. We had an enormous Jewish population. No one's heard of it. There's no buildings left, but there's social histories there. And we capture that, and it's always booked out. Come and see the first ever halal butcher in Glasgow. It's in your street. There's no plaque. There's nothing, but people have a history of that. And those walking tours are great because you can always have an interpreter. You don't need a written word. And there's a communal element to sharing those stories as you go around. We can't do enough of them. Go for it. Yeah, go for
it. Frank, you want to pick up on that one?
Yeah, I think that there are lots of examples in Gaelic culture about collecting people together to talk about stories and to talk about, I'm thinking of one of our friends who did a thing about people who went to sea and came back and talked about those stories about what they learned. And it wasn't just about going to sea, it was about growing up, and it was about traveling, and it was about getting other jobs, and so on and so forth. One of the great things about the Ghabhsainn book I mentioned a few minutes ago is the amount of stories that has generated since the publication. People getting in touch with me, telling me other bits of stories, or recognizing their ancestors in some of these accounts and whatnot, and supplying other sides of the story or other bits of information that would never have come out if that book hadn't come out and hit the shelves and whatnot. So, I mean, I do like to be provocative in a sense. I think to try and challenge people to get out their mindset thinking. I'm a bit wary of this thinking outside the box, because people tend to shift the box when you're outside the box. So you have to think about how you can relate to that wider picture. But certainly in terms of more stories and gathering information about these things, I'm doing something just now, for example, about with a chap in the Faroe Islands, looking at place names in the Hebrides and the Faroes that are related to bird place names. This is in Gaelic, obviously. So the names of a place, Crickanyola, the Eagle's Rock, and so on and so forth. And I have discovered hundreds of local place names just in the Outer Hebrides alone. And some of these reflect the changing attitudes towards wildlife. Some of them reflect the changing vocabulary as it goes through. For example, the seagull disappeared, and now it's back again, for example, and coming to different places. Surprisingly, there's no one place I've found there that's called, the Hill of the Corncrake, for example. And I think it's because the corncrake was so ubiquitous that why would you call that Hill of the Corncrake? There's another one over there and another one over there. And so it just got airbrushed out of the vocabulary of place names, for example. So even looking at these gaps and these absences tells you a lot about how people related to the land and how they thought about these things as it goes through, and how the communities then linked together. Many of the place names were functional, so people would go to collect birds for eating because they'd had nothing else to eat, or they'd go and collect eggs, for example. Other things about well-known places in the landscape, that's where the cuckoo was, and you didn't necessarily see the bird, but you heard the cuckoo advertising its presence, so that was the place, or the Hill of the Cuckoo. So these things are, that gives that rich tapestry to the land. And if you're looking at a map, I went to the National Library of Scotland earlier on in the book. And Agnes came with me to chaperone me to make sure I behaved myself. But basically, I got exploded a whole range of these things, and I asked them what was the very first map that mentions Ghabhsainn, and it goes back literally to the beginning of cartography in Europe. And it goes back, and you can see these things on the place, and you can see how it's changed over the years, and how our perception of the land has changed, because we didn't have drones then. You hadn't got a satellite view. You had a perception of that by simply traveling around there. And so it was the seafarers that made the connection by boat that had a better idea of the topography of the map, because they went from island to islands. Weren't remote then. That's another one of my pet hates. Remote. Islands weren't remote then. They were the center of things. They were the nodes that connected other places. If you had a boat, you could go anywhere. If you tried to go over land, there were no roads, there were no cars, so it was hard to move around. But if you had a boat, you can go anywhere. And so the seafarer tradition actually began to name places and to recognize places and to link all these things together in a wider source. And that shows you as part of that trade. And even on the shore here, in Ghabhsainn, and the midden, the old rubbish dump from an Iron Age rubbish dump, and there's a Norse settlement right beside it, and there's overlays a pre-Iron Age settlement that we don't know how old it is really. It goes back to the beginning of people coming to this place, and so in those remains you find things like brooches that have come from faraway places. There's a brooch I found there's only two found like it before, one in a Viking grave in Norway and one in a Viking grave in the Isle of Man. And then there's one here. And these may have been linked. You find that in the local historical society, just a few miles away from here, there's an exhibition just now about some swords and some silverware and so on that were discovered in the peats, and that links things like amber beads from the Black Sea with walrus tusks that have come from, you know, the Greenland coast. The Vikings had a trade in walrus ivory at one point. They had a monopoly of that, basically. So these places were not isolated; they were highly connected. You know, in the west of Ireland in the 8th century was the Enlightenment centre of Europe, yeah. And so the idea that people then live in this little box and don't know what they're talking about is hugely different. You know, there's a wonderful story I have in a book about one of these grand tours where the visitor had thrust himself upon the big house in the Highlands, and then he wrote in his account of it a very disparaging report. The rooms were drafty and cold, the food was poor, the owner was a barbarian. You know, and there's a little asterisk in the book, and the editor of the book said, "Let it be known that the barbarian that the person's talking about spoke 7 languages fluently, whereas he spoke 1, and that poorly." So it's that interconnection with place that really is important to me. It's the ecology, the human ecology of a place that really is quite motivating and inspiring for me.
Mairi, can I move on and maybe just take another dimension to this, and that in the context of our trust? And can I just invite people in the audience, if you have any questions, please either raise your hand or put it in the chat box, and then we'll pick it up that way. As you know, we were a wee bit later in starting, and I had my internet problem. We're due to stop at 12. But, you know, if we're not going to stop in the middle of a question. So if you want to leave at 12, please leave at 12. Feel free to do so. But we won't go much beyond that at all. So my question, Mairi, is, you know, over the years, you know, we've had some really interesting examples of community development leading to economic development. And I wonder, is there sometimes a danger of monetizing our shared cultural heritage? And does it matter if we do?
Thanks, Agnes. Oh, I was looking forward to answering the last question. I'm like nodding away, getting a sore neck, but this is a great question too. And well, I've got so many thoughts on this. My goodness. I mean, I think we need to radically restructure our entire economy, but that's not what you're asking me, really. So I suppose the examples that I was going to talk about are really about what Fatima was talking about, this idea of, you know, community in action, about conviviality, about kind of resisting the commodification of cultural heritage and the monetizing of culture. You know, I think that's where the real magic lies. And I suppose over the last 2 decades and more, I suppose, we've really seen the kind of acceleration of cultural heritage being co-opted, commodified into the heritage and tourism industries. It was a huge boom, which had its benefits, of course, but these industries are very much built on a particular economic ideology, if you like, the kind of extraction of cultural and social wealth for economic growth. And in this process, it really strips out so much of what really sustains culture and community at the root, if you like. You know, it's all about maximizing profits through increasing visitor numbers, more people, more flights, more Airbnbs, and it's not exactly a winning formula. And I think it's true to say, particularly where we are in the world, that, you know, many of our places are so dependent on tourism now, which again has some benefits, of course it does, but it's a very precarious place to be and comes with other challenges. You know, lack of access to land. My generation is such a challenge, lack of access to land and housing, not to mention the huge environmental impact of global travel. You know, many of us choosing not to fly. And I think it's such a complex question, such a vital question, and really, you know, about how we organize our economies, what we prioritize. And I would say if monetizing heritage can be a way of, seeding new forms of economic relations at a local level, at a community level, kind of building this interdependency from below, then that can only be a good thing. And, a community land, of course, holds so much possibility in this vein, building the infrastructure that we need to respond to future crisis or contemporary crisis. But it's very difficult to, build and operate any kind of alternative economy or solidarity economy with all these external pressures of living in a world dominated by such rampant capitalism. I don't know the answer, but I think it can be done in a way that really can support communities, but there's just external pressures at work. So I don't know what others think.
No, I think that's a really good answer, Mairi. Fatima, looking at your own situation there, is this something that we can do? Is this something that's possible for a community to do and realize the value of, the money value of, but retain the integrity, I guess, is the real question.
I hate the commodification of our history. It puts it into, well, I don't like it for lots of reasons I won't go into, other than it makes it almost inaccessible for people unless they have money to purchase that. And it creates a culture, it creates a culture that's worthy because you can pay for it and it's valued at that. And then you've got the rest of the stuff where it's, it's tact, it's not worthwhile. It's, how do you monetize oral history? How do you monetize stories where you can publish them and then sell them, which we do. We get a grant to do that. So we make sure every library has a free copy. We make steps to make it accessible and we keep it cheap. None of our books are more than a tenner, most are a fiver. But still, we often find ourselves saying, there you go. You've got to read that because you'll love it. I can't afford it, don't worry. But it is a problem. And I think the funders, if they're there, I don't know, but the Scottish Government also has a role to play in this, because we're told constantly, become a social enterprise, see what you can sell to generate income, have a matrix of funding, and the pressures to look for things to sell is there, and it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. It's something we should have a right to. I mean, we should have a right to a lot of things, but we should have a right to it. And it's a really difficult balance for charities like us to, if we have a museum, are we going to have to charge for it? Well, yes and no. And we need to, why should we be having that discussion? Why should we be keeping some heritage away from people who can't afford it? It's a horrible situation to be in, but it's reality and we have to deal with it and try and be as creative as possible in doing that. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Fatima. Frank, quickly, I'm going to just kind of move this along a bit, but I would like your own view on just, is it possible to retain the integrity and still do something with this that benefits the community?
It is absolutely, but it's based around the question of power. Who has the power to do that? Who has the power to change things? Who has the power to benefit from these things? Commoditization is popping up all over the place in ways that people would not normally use in normal conversation. So, for example, the selling off of croft tenancies throughout the Highlands and Islands, simply because people want to buy a house and they don't give a toss about the land. They don't want to work the croft. They have no interest in that. We even have people who are buying crofts because they like the view, and they're buying the adjacent croft because they don't want anybody building a house in between them and the view. And that's forcing the actual use of the land out of the equation. That commoditization. We're seeing the same commoditization in the rush for carbon capture and people wanting to buy land to offset the damage they're doing elsewhere, and thinking that's somehow beneficial. It's like, I don't travel, therefore you can travel a lot, and it doesn't matter how much pollution that goes into the atmosphere, but between us it evens it out. No, it doesn't. The pollution is still going in the atmosphere. So that commoditization is a hugely important thing in terms of actually looking at that. It's about how the power is divided with these things. When you actually have the power to control these things and to reinvest that in the economy and take decisions about doing that, that makes the change. That's what actually changes things down. And that's what we're seeing with community land ownership. The power to actually say, no, we don't want that. Well, we're not doing that. We're not interested in doing that. But you can make a lot of money. Yeah, but we don't want it. Thank you very much. We're not. Or the alternative thing there with agencies saying, we're not going to invest in that. We say, we don't give a shit what you want. We're doing it anyway. We have money. We're going to do it. End of. So that actually having the power to do these things is fundamental in this change. And that is about participatory democracy. It's about making these things, being involved in these things, not just actually ticking a box every 4 or 5 years and electing someone to do it on your behalf.
All right. All right. Do we have any questions? No? No questions coming up? In that case, I'm going to wind this up at this stage because I just know I love this topic, and it's quite clear that everybody participating today does too. It can take you in so many directions. Just to finish off the session, I have one last question for each of our 3 panelists. I don't want a long answer. I want a quick answer. And I for our audience today, I haven't given them a head up that this is coming, so they have had a chance to think about it. And the question is, what would you want your cultural legacy to be to future generations? Mairi, I'll come to you first.
Oh my goodness, huge question. Well, with this, I could only really think of my daughter here. And, you know, I want her to grow up and live in a world where she is resourced by a culture that keeps her connected to the earth and gives her strength and courage in the face of climate change and collapse, and to be able to live a meaningful life supported by community. I'd love for her to know the names of the birds and the trees and the rivers and the mountains and all the songs and stories and music and poetry that goes with that. And I'd love that for all children. It's such a gift, you know, to be connected, to belong, to care, and to be part of this carrying stream. Here you go.
Go on, Frank, follow that.
Yeah, I think it's true. I think what I would like to do is diversity. I would like to see an improvement in biodiversity. It's long been a bone of contention for me that private estates can go from one estate to the other and can change hands without doing any environmental audit if they've improved or made the situation worse. Whereas community land goes through this filter quite rightly, I think, to check these things, to see if they're going to do it because there's public money involved. I would like to see increased biodiversity. I would like to see increased cultural diversity, and that means that your indigenous culture needs to be strengthened. Not to say it's better than anybody else, but damn it, it's as good as, and we have this heritage behind us that we can defend and speak about. So I would like to see increasing diversity from both multicultural and biodiversity.
Fatima, last word to you.
We see ourselves as custodians of a building and a heritage that has gone before, but also help a legacy that has created pathways for other people to build on. But ultimately, we can't leave the world in a worse place than it was. We've got to make a difference. And I think that community activism, I think that drives our work, is our legacy. You know, you have to fight to make things better. They will not do it for you. You've got to do it yourself.
Thank you very much, Fatima. Thank you, Mairi, and thank you, Frank, too. I hope those of you with us today have enjoyed that discussion as much as I have, and I've found it both provocative and informative, and also something to take away from it, very much in the spirit of what Community Land Scotland is all about and will be certainly about in the years to come. Thank you all very much for joining us today and for staying with us. Sorry we've gone a wee bit over time, not too much. Thank you very much again, and safe journey to wherever you go for the rest of the day. Thank you.